Good afternoon, Iowa friends. What a wonderful blessing you folks have to be able to celebrate the golden anniversary of Christian Evangelistic Mission. My name is David O'Grady, and I serve as Director of Church Relations at Good News Productions International. But this afternoon I've been asked to do something else, and that is to introduce Bob Scott, who is going to tell us a brief history overview of what Christian Evangelistic Mission is all about. Bob?
Thank you, David. We live in a very different world than we had in 1957. Leaders of the churches in Iowa a good many of them could remember the great revivals of the 20s, the Depression of the 30s, World War II in the 40s. The time of the 50s was a time of good economy and things were doing well, but the churches were suffering from many of the positions taken by the old colleges like Drake University. The Iowa Christian Missionary Society wanted to make it look like the problem was a difference between the way the churches supported missionaries, when in reality it was a difference about the interpretation of the Scripture. The Missionary Society sued several churches in Iowa. The result was many churches were solid scripturally, but fearful of any organization that could threaten them or take away their freedom. A small but effective effort bringing churches together had already happened with churches in a region working together on Christian service camps. But it was obvious that something bigger was needed to do something about starting new churches. So I believe that God was about to turn a new page of history for starting new churches in Iowa. A group of Christians were meeting in a hotel in Denison, Iowa, and they asked Elmer Kodge, who was a student preacher from Nebraska Christian College, preaching at Ute, Iowa, to come over and preach for them on Sunday afternoon, which he did. And yet he knew that starting a new church there was going to be beyond his ability. So he wrote to churches asking them to come and see what they could do about starting a new church in Denison. 3 meetings were held at Ute at his invitation to talk about what could be done. The end result of that was a small committee was appointed to consider what could be done, if anything, about starting new churches. Well, that committee met in the church at Storm Lake on June 3rd, 1957, and went over plans and thoughts that they had in regard to what could be done. I presented a paper I'd prepared on what is essentially the Christian Evangelistic Mission today. About 80 men gathered at church that night, and the proposal that I had made was read line by line. After careful discussion and a period of questions and answers, it was unanimously determined to start the mission. And so on the evening of June 3rd, 1957, the CEM was brought into existence. One of the provisions in the plan that the mission would be governed by 9 directors that were elders and preachers of Iowa churches. So immediately after deciding to start the mission, the group decided to elect those people. And so the elders that were selected were Silas Steele from Sutherland, Marvin Helkin from Storm Lake, Ernie Kuntz from Fertile, Kermit Doolittle from Webster City, and Lester Wallace from Mondamon. The preachers were Alvin Geese from Storm Lake, Albert Delbridge from Cherokee, Kendall Bauer from Mondamon, and myself from Webster City. To my knowledge, Kermit Doolittle and I are the only ones that remain out of those original 9 men. Before leaving that night, that little group of men selected officers to determine which ones would lead different tasks and to set a time and place for their next meeting. At the first meeting of those directors then, it was decided to start a prayer program that the mission and set a date for a survey to be taken at Denison. A good response from the churches made it possible to move ahead so that in January of 1958, Harold Hammond and his family moved to Denison to begin that new church. The church got started, bought a nice piece of ground, built a new building, but in time it failed. The directors learned a lot about starting new churches.
Thanks for sharing that brief history of the beginning of the CEM and the start of the first church. But I'm inquisitive, Bob. I wonder about the legal situation and the lawsuits. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, David, because of the lawsuits by the Iowa Christian Missionary Society, Many of our churches thought the evil was in the organization. Somehow that fear had to be overcome if we were ever going to do anything bigger than just the regional things, which resulted in many of the camps. So, in the very beginning, the articles that were prepared and we presented at Storm Lake, it was called the Christian Evangelistic Association. Voting at the annual meeting was limited to those who gave $1 per month to the association. This was to assure that the mission could not be taken over by anyone outside of the people who are giving, and that the leaders would always be elders and preachers of Iowa churches. And secondly, every 10 years, the supporters would be asked at an annual meeting to approve the going on of the mission or to stop. So it was not to be continually on without end. So in 1960, I believe that was the year, it was apparent that no outside group was going to try to take over, so the name was changed to a Christian Evangelistic Mission, and each voter at the annual meeting had to be only an immersed believer. That was one change that was made. Another item that may be of interest to you is the term for church planters. In the original plans that we talked about that afternoon and that I had written, I used the word evangelists, plural. And one of the men said, well, we probably will never have more than one. We'll just make that singular. And I said, well, that's probably true. But perchance there come a time when we start one before another is completed. It may be that we'll have two at one time. I'm so thankful that one time we had 8 full-time preachers working for our evangelistic mission, and we're very grateful for that. So I would add one more thing, that God has blessed this mission because we've had really godly men lead it. The directors are expected to support the mission and give their time and travel expense as a gift. A man gets into the leadership of the mission because he really cares about new churches in Iowa, and God has blessed that idea. There's another item of God's blessing that I think should be noted. In the early days, there were a number of nucleus groups meeting in various places around the state, something like was going on at Denison. Often these groups would appeal to the CEM for help, and we helped all that we could. This was one of the reasons for our rapid early growth. In time, we used up all of these groups. We decided to call a full-time worker to create Bible study groups in as many places as he could and to develop them into nucleus groups for new churches. Charlie Johnson, preaching at Ankeny, one of the churches that we had started, accepted the challenge, and he became our first evangelist at large. His duty included counseling and encouraging the preachers on our staff. After 16 years, I believe it was, Charlie resigned and Rod Roberts took over, and we are so glad for his ministry. Well, David, this is a very brief little look at the history of CEM, but I believe it's a picture of the hand of God at work in a wonderful state.
Thank you, Bob, for sharing the mind power and the experience that you've had over many years of working in the state of Iowa. We certainly appreciate that. And dear friends, have a wonderful, wonderful celebration this afternoon and evening. God bless.